Like I said, this lesson is focused on self-report techniques and design. And our two main forms of self-report techniques and design would be questionnaires and interviews. And these are typically non-experimental research methods, in that there is very rarely any direct manipulation of a variable, being the independent variable, by the researcher. In terms of our lesson objectives, so we want to be able to outline and distinguish between two self-report techniques, being interviews and questionnaires. We also want to be able to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative data, structured and unstructured interviews, open and closed questions. And of course, as always in psychology, we need to appraise these research methods. So we need to consider the strengths and limitations for each research method. And if at any point, again, like I said before, if you were asked to design your own study, you would be able to say, I have chosen to use an interview because blah, 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 these are the strengths. However, I've also considered the limitations, which are X, Y, Z. So what are self-report techniques? So it's literally in the name. It's when an individual reports on themselves. And self-report studies involve asking participants questions. Some researchers find it beneficial to ask participants directly about their lifestyle, their beliefs, ideas, and so on. These can be written in the form of a questionnaire, or it can be asked orally in real time. So in a face-to-face, telephone, Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, in the form of an interview. And this is a really interesting point because, of course, we are in a particular unique situation where we are in a global pandemic. And what I've found when speaking to my doctoral friends, even speaking to my supervisor for my doctorate, she's mentioned that there's an increase in the number of researchers who are using online platforms to distribute questionnaires, using online platforms to hold interviews as a way of conducting their research. Focusing on questionnaires. So our key definition, a questionnaire is a self-report technique whereby a set of predetermined written questions are used to collect data. They are always structured in nature. Questionnaires allow the researcher to ask participants directly about their intentions and feelings, and this overcomes the assumptive guessing nature of observations. However, there's still going to be the issue of social desirability bias, whereby if you're asking someone, oh, why did you do this? Or why do you believe this? They might, twist their genuine view in order to present themselves in a positive light. When it comes to questionnaires, we cannot control whether or not people supply truthful answers. People may simply answer in a socially desirable way to present themselves in a positive light, and this will in turn affect the internal validity of the study. In terms of the overall strengths and limitations of questionnaires. So questionnaires can be distributed to a large number of people, resulting in a large sample, which is good for what? What is it good for? Can anyone tell me the words that we need to put in that space?
Population validity.
Population validity, certainly. And then also the word that begins with GEN.
Generalizability.
Really. Respondents may be willing to share more personal information in a questionnaire than an interview. So people are more likely to be honest and, divulge unique, very, sensitive information about themselves in a questionnaire than in an interview, research has shown. There may be less social desirability bias via a questionnaire than in an interview. This idea that you can complete a questionnaire anonymously and submit it, whereas in an interview, you're face-to-face essentially, so you might feel more inclined to present yourself in a positive light. But then there are some limitations with questionnaires. Social desirability bias remains an issue. People may be untruthful in their answers. Questionnaires are only filled in by people who can read and write. And if you can't read or write, then it means you're not part of the sample. And then it means as a researcher, you are not capturing a key group in the population. And then finally, you've got this issue of an eager sample. When it comes to questionnaires and engaging in research just generally, you always get the same type of people who are willing to partake in research and they're helpful. This means that, again, you as the researcher, you may be missing out on a separate group of people, those group of people who aren't willing to take part in research or who wouldn't normally volunteer themselves. What they have to share on a topic is still important, but you may not get them involved in your study, and that will limit the generalizability of your study. When it comes to questionnaire design, the validity, objectivity, and overall scientific nature of a questionnaire is dependent on its design. So the way a question is written, we know, may produce a biased response. And I want you to think back to the topic of memory. What study from eyewitness testimony revealed the impact that questions can have on respondents' answers? Can anyone remember that study?
Yes, I can remember it.
Yes, please do share, Shay.
It was the leading question study with the car crash. They changed the verb. So it was like contacted, hit, smashed. I can't really remember them clearly. And then the groups like produced different answers to some of the questions that were being asked, like was there smashed glass anywhere, or how hard or how fast do you think the car was going?
Yeah. Brilliant. Shay, that was a fantastic outline of the study. You are absolutely correct. It was that study by Loftus. And you're right that they simply just changed the verb when they were asking these different groups the same question, just with that changed verb. And what they found is that in the condition where they were given the question, how fast were the cars traveling when they smashed into each other, they reported higher speeds in comparison to the group who were asked how fast were they traveling when they contacted each other. And that really reveals to you and I, anytime we're writing a question for a questionnaire, we have to think, is my question potentially leading? Am I using the correct words here? Could my question produce a biased response? Is it objective? So yeah, that's brilliant. Well done. So therefore, when writing questions, there are 3 guiding principles. And these are, we're looking at 3 in particular, but of course there are lots of things that we can consider when writing questions, but these are the main 3. So clarity, your question must be very, very clear. It shouldn't be too wordy. It shouldn't use words that are unfamiliar to your target population. Questions should be clear and high in face validity. Now, face validity is an interesting type of validity. It's this idea that if I'm smiling, you can read into it and you can look at my face and you can identify the emotions that I'm exhibiting. If I'm frowning, you can identify the emotions that I'm exhibiting. Face validity is if you say to me, this is a questionnaire on personality, Miss Kay, and I would like you to fill it out. And as I'm completing the questionnaire, I'm seeing very, very random questions like, who were your forefathers' ancestors and what village are you from in Nigeria? That to me doesn't seem like it's a questionnaire on personality like you said it was. Another example would be if you were to sit an exam, a psychology exam, and you've been told, yeah, this is a psychology exam, but the questions on the paper are not assessing your knowledge of psychology. They're assessing your knowledge of something like really random, like Greek mythology. You would look at that question, like the paper, and say, it's low in face validity because it's not assessing what they set out to assess. I've also put here double-barreled questions. So where there's 2 questions in one, that reduces the clarity of the question. If you're using big words that aren't familiar, like I said, that reduces the clarity of the question as well. Bias. So any bias in a question can produce a biased answer, and we looked at the example by Loftus and how just tweaking a word can actually cause there to be some sort of bias in the response. And then finally, analysis. Anytime you create a question, you have to think, how am I going to analyze this question? And this is where you have the contrast between open and closed questions. Open questions allow for people to elaborate on their answers and to provide more detail. They generate qualitative data. So this is quality data, rich detail. But these are difficult to analyze. You literally have to transcribe people's responses, and you have to group them into different categories, and you might use a thematic analysis. It's very lengthy in terms of analyzing responses to open questions. But what you might say is that open questions can be used as a pilot study. And remember, a pilot study is a study that you conduct before the official study to gauge people's consensus on a particular topic, and to see whether there are questions that absolutely will not work for the real study, or questions that you perhaps didn't consider that you now need to consider for the actual study. In contrast, you've got closed questions, and these type of questions force participants to choose an option. And in terms of choosing an option, it could be that you give them a question that requires a yes/no response, a question that has a one-word response, a question that has a selection of options and they are to tick one box. These type of questions can lack validity, because I'm sure many of you might have been in a situation where you've been given a question and they've presented you with a set of options, and none of those options that they presented you with, none of them fit your true feelings towards that particular topic, and therefore you're not going to capture people's true feelings. You're capturing their bent, their subjective feelings based on the options you've offered them. However, closed questions are easy to analyze because they produce quantitative data, i.e. numerical data. However, they can lack detail. And just a few examples, and I won't dwell on this for too long because I know that you guys will be familiar with open and closed questions. But if you can answer a question with only a yes or no, that would be a closed ended type of question. Whereas if you require more than one word to answer the question, then that will be known as an open-ended question. And I've put a few examples here. So if I was to ask you, is psychology your favorite subject? Your options are yes or no. And I'm sure a majority of you will say to me, yes, amen. If I was to ask you, what's your favorite memory from childhood? This you cannot answer with a yes or no response. You actually have to elaborate. You have to give some detail in your response. What do you plan to do immediately post-lockdown, post-pandemic? This, again, you can't give a yes/no response. You would need to elaborate on it. I put in the green box here, closed-ended questions should not always be thought of as simple questions that anyone can quickly answer, merely because they require a yes or no answer. Closed-ended questions can also be very complicated, and you will know this from, previous assessments where you've received a multiple choice exam question. Sometimes those multiple choice exam questions can be tricky. They require effortful thinking, so we shouldn't just assume that closed questions are easy questions, because they are not. So let's have a look at the different types of questions before we move on to interviews. We have what is known as Likert Scales. Some people pronounce it Likert Scales, Likert Scales, however you pronounce it, as long as you spell it correctly is no problem. So Likert scaling is a bipolar scaling method. And bipolar just meaning two polar endings. So there's two opposite endings. Measuring either positive or negative response to a statement. Sometimes an even point scale is used, where the middle option of neither agree nor disagree is not available. So you've got an example here of an even point scale, and you've got an example here of an odd point scale. You can see here on the even point scale, you literally have to choose either end as to where your opinion sits, whether you're on the disagree side or whether you're on the agree side. With the odd point scale, why has it moved away from me? With the odd point scale, you can see that you've actually got this dustbin category. And this is almost like the bane of every single researcher. You give someone a questionnaire and literally for every single question, they've selected undecided, undecided, undecided. You're not getting any real polarized view, and sometimes that can be problematic for researchers. Having said that, it does give people the opportunity to genuinely say if they are undecided on a topic, and you're not forcing them to choose to either agree or disagree, even if they're saying agree slightly or disagree slightly. So this is one type of question, Likert Scales. Give an example of a Likert scale, put your rating in the chat. Rate the UK government's response to the pandemic on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being very poor and 5 being excellent. I've seen Elliot's put -3. Most of you are selecting 1, seen 2. Yeah, so I think most of us would agree that it's been a quite poor response, very, very laid back and lazy in comparison to other countries who are now living their best lives, and we are still in a pandemonium, as I like to call it. But we move, we're alive, we're healthy, and we continue to charge on. So you've had an opportunity to engage in a Likert scale question. So well done. We have contingent questions, and these type of questions depend on the answer to the preceding question. So for example, if there was a question that said, do you believe in ghosts, yes or no? If yes, you continue to question 3. If no, go to question 4. It's this idea that you're using a question as a kind of filtering system. Now, in terms of how we might want to improve a questionnaire, you can use filler questions. And filler questions is where you include random, unrelated questions embedded in the questionnaire to overcome the issue of demand characteristics. So let's say, for example, you've got those Likert scale items and someone's constantly circling 333, undecided, or no opinion. You might put in a statement that might be unrelated to the actual survey questionnaire, but would actually force someone to choose an opinion. And that way you'll be able to whittle out who is being serious about the questionnaire and who is literally engaging in what we would term as the screw you effect. Sequence of questions is important. That if you are creating a questionnaire, even when it comes to creating exam assessment pieces, you will notice that they generally tend to go from the easiest type of questions to the hardest type of questions. And this can reduce resistance and anxiety in the respondent. It's so important that you conduct a pilot study. This is something that even my supervisor has emphasized to me for my PhD. This idea that you must test out your questions on a small group of people, and then you use that test to refine your questions that you will use in your final study. Pilot studies are really useful for identifying any potential issues and so on. And sampling techniques. So we understand that when it comes to questionnaires, you normally get responses from a very eager sample, those who are always willing and able to volunteer themselves. But the way to overcome that might be to use an alternative sampling method, such as random sampling or stratified as well. So just a quick summary on our types of questions. So now we move on to interviews, and then you guys are going to engage in a task for interviews, and then we'll come to the end of the lesson. So key definition of interviews. Interviews are a self-report technique whereby data is collected via a real-time interaction with another individual being the interviewer. Interviews generate qualitative data and can offer deeper insight than questionnaires. However, the data generated may be subjective and difficult to generalize. In addition, they can be time-consuming and expensive to conduct. There are 2 types of interviews. We have what we call structured interviews with predetermined questions. And this is where there's absolutely no deviation from the original question set. And we have unstructured interviews. And this is where questions are developed during the course of the interview. The interviewer may begin with a few predetermined questions and develop new emerging questions on the basis of the answers given. And this is sometimes known as a clinical interview. This type of interview requires a lot of skill on the interviewer's part because they have to know how to come up with suitable questions on the spot. So let's have a look at the strengths and limitations of structured and unstructured interviews. For structured interviews, this is where you're asking every single participant the exact same questions. These type of interviews can be easily repeated, so you have high reliability with these type of interviews rather. And it means that the answers from different people on the same question can be compared. A limitation, however, is still on reliability, is that the reliability of the interview can be compromised if the interviewer behaves differently towards different interviewees. So even if you're asking everyone the exact same question in the interviews, if your behavior is different, then you might elicit a completely, different, unique response from each participant just based on your own behavior as an interviewer. And that might be a problem. In contrast, for unstructured interviews, you get more detailed information than you would in a structured interview. In an unstructured interview, they require interviewers that are trained and have and are more skilled because they have to come up with questions on the spot. And these type of interviewers are expensive. And as there are no predetermined questions, the questions that come up in the interview may lack objectivity. And as a result, it affects the reliability of unstructured interviews. You can't really compare, as you would be able to in a structured interview, you can't really compare participants side by side. And like we mentioned for questionnaires, the same 3 principles in terms of designing these questionnaires apply to designing interview questions. So clarity, lack of bias, and thinking about how you're going to analyze those results later on. And there are a few other design features of an interview. It's important to record the interview, either audio or video record the interview, as well as having the interview session scribed. Now, having them scribed, all that means is that after the interview, you're listening back to that audio or you're watching back the video and you are writing word for word. So verbatim, you're writing word for word everything that was said in the interview, including the questions that were asked by the interviewer and the responses of the interviewee. That can take a very long time. If the interviewer is required to listen and note down the interviewee's answers, their listening may interfere with their writing and vice versa. So it's really helpful to have a recording so that you're giving the person you're interviewing eye-to-eye contact, showing them that you're listening and not got your head down, just writing down everything that they say. Also, writing or not writing can come across intimidating or as a sign of error to the interviewee. So if you've ever been in an interview situation where the person is like writing at certain points during the interview, you might pause and think, oh, am I saying something wrong? It might make you feel uncomfortable. We understand that the interviewer themselves can have an effect on the interviewee. So the presence of an interviewer who seems interested can yield fruitful, detailed answers. So this means that the interviewer must be mindful of their non-verbal communication, their body language, their posture, eye contact, and also their verbal communication. They shouldn't be interrupting the interviewee as they're speaking. They should allow them to finish. They also need to be an active listener. So oftentimes a very, very good interviewer would, after the interviewee has perhaps shared their ideas or shared their thoughts on something, they might repeat it to them and say, oh, this is what you said. Do you mind elaborating on that? And that way you're showing them that you're an active listener. Joe, you've asked, is this the same as an unstructured observation? It wouldn't be the same as an unstructured observation, only because an interview is literally between you as a researcher and your participants, and you're asking them questions directly. An unstructured observation is where you're allowing the participants to behave themselves independently, and you're literally just noting down what you can see. Interviewer bias. This is where the interviewer's expectations are unconsciously communicated and they have an effect on the respondent's behavior. So the presence of an interviewer, and not only that, but the way that they carry themselves can have an effect on the person who is being interviewed. If you've ever been in a situation where someone has asked you a question and they repeat that same question, it makes you think, oh, the answer that I gave at first, was it a good answer? You know, and when you do that, you're making the interviewee uncomfortable, but it means that you're actually imposing your expectations onto them and you're not getting their true opinions on a topic. So it's really important that our interviewers are very, very skilled. And then lastly, thinking about ethical issues in psychology. For both questionnaires and interviews, participants should be briefed about what the questionnaire or the interview is about. And if you're not telling them the true aims, then you must debrief them. Participants must give informed consent to take part. So that goes for questionnaires and interviews. Even if it's taken place on an online platform, they must give their informed consent. Questions should not cause psychological harm. This is really important. They shouldn't cause unnecessary embarrassment or discomfort. If they do, you must follow up in your debrief by pointing your participants to the right resources, the right helplines that they can get further assistance from. Questions should not ask for personal information, and answers should be kept confidential. Now, on this part, you might say, well, miss, like a questionnaire is going to ask for personal information, such as maybe their gender, their date of birth. The rule is, do not ask questions that you genuinely don't need for your research. So if for your research, you don't need to know the participant's date of birth, don't ask them for their date of birth. But if you know that later on you want to offer some sort of comparison between people within a particular age group and another age group, then you must ask for their date of birth. So only ask for personal information that you need. And then finally, any published research should disguise the participant's identity. So this idea of keeping the results anonymous, referring to them using pseudonyms is also useful.
Pause the video here so that you can complete this task where you will watch an interview. The link is in the description box. Whilst you're watching the interview, I want you to identify at least 3 issues with the interview and also think about the solutions. How can the interview be made better? You'll hear some of the feedback from the students who were in this actual lesson concerning this interview.
The biggest issue that our group found was his body language. And it was almost like, in a way, like sexual, so it violates the ethical issue of protection from psychological harm. And so our solution would have been to, our solution would have been to actually like behave in a more appropriate way for the situation.
Absolutely.
Like sit further away from each other because they're like quite on top of each other.
So body language was an issue, perhaps his use of professional language, his stance. And there needs to be a good enough space between you and the interviewee. Thank you so much, Joe. Just one more person to share.
The questions he was asking weren't really appropriate. Like he was asking if she had a boyfriend and asking her to come to the pub later on. So it was like nothing really to do with the job application that she was going for, which could make her feel quite uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So the type of questions that he was asking in terms of the face validity, it lacked all manners of face validity for a job interview situation. Guys, you have been fabulous. Well done. Well done for engaging. I hope that this particular part of research methods has been clear and enjoyable.
Thank you, Miss.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Miss.
Miss.
You're welcome.